You keep riding into places where white men disappear, cowboy. The voice drifted down from somewhere above the canyon, calm as evening wind, and Elias Mercer slowly lifted his eyes toward the red cliffs glowing beneath the last light of sunset. For a moment, he saw nothing except jagged stone and drifting dust. Then she stepped forward. The Apache woman stood near the edge of the ridge, motionless against the burning sky, her dark braid moving softly in the wind behind her. She carried no rifle, no fear, just a bow resting loosely in one hand, like she already knew she would never need to use it. Elias sat quietly in his saddle, one hand near the reins, the other hanging still beside his coat. Most men in Black Creek avoided this canyon after dark. The old ranchers said spirits lived here. The drunks in the saloon said Apache warriors watched from the rocks at night. But Elias had stopped believing campfire stories years ago. What unsettled him wasn't the canyon. It was her. Funny thing, Elias called back, his voice rough from dust and miles. I've heard the same thing about you. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. Not anger. Amusement. Barely visible, but enough to make something tighten in his chest. She descended the rocky slope with impossible balance, boots silent against loose stone, until she stopped less than 15 feet away. Up close, Elias could see details the shadows had hidden before. The faint scar near her jawline. The turquoise beads braided into her leather necklace. The sharpness in her dark eyes that came from surviving too many winters too young. She looked at him the way wild horses looked at strangers near water, cautious, ready to leave at the smallest wrong movement. You're too close, cowboy, she said softly. Elias glanced around the empty canyon. Closest town's 12 miles north. I'm not talking about the canyon. The wind moved between them, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. Somewhere farther downriver, water struck stone in slow, steady rhythm. Elias should have turned his horse around right then. Every instinct told him this woman carried trouble like thunder carried storms. But loneliness has a strange way of making a man ignore warnings, especially when the warning comes from a pair of eyes he cannot stop thinking about. You always threaten strangers like this? He asked. Only the ones who keep coming back. That answer stayed with him long after she walked away. He watched her disappear deeper into the canyon, her figure fading into shadow until only silence remained. Yet somehow the silence felt heavier than words. Black Creek was loud that night. Piano music spilled through the saloon windows. Boots scraped across wooden floors. Men argued over cards beneath lantern smoke thick enough to sting the eyes. But the moment Elias stepped inside, conversations shifted. Old ranchers looked up from whiskey glasses. A stable boy stopped sweeping near the stove. Even Marshal Brody paused halfway through lighting his cigar. You went near Red Hollow again, the marshal muttered. Elias removed his gloves slowly. Maybe. The old man behind the bar exhaled sharply. Boy, that Apache woman buried 3 prospectors' horses outside that canyon last spring. Men say she protects something out there. Elias leaned against the counter. Men say lots of things when they're scared. And smart men listen. Elias almost answered, but something caught his attention through the saloon window. Across the dark street, beyond the swinging lanterns and drifting dust, stood a single rider watching the town from the shadows. The Apache woman, Nayeli. Her eyes found his immediately, even from half a block away. Then, slowly, she touched 2 fingers against the turquoise pendant hanging near her throat before turning her horse back toward the canyon. Elias felt his pulse slow for reasons he couldn't explain. Because for the first time in years, something in this world had looked at him like it already knew who he used to be. The next morning, Elias Mercer woke before sunrise for the first time in months, though he could not have explained why. The small rented room above the Black Creek stable smelled of cold wood, leather, and dust carried in through the cracked window during the night. Outside, the town still slept beneath pale blue dawn, quiet except for distant horses shifting in their stalls and the low whistle of wind moving across empty streets. Elias sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a long moment, staring at the old silver pocket watch resting in his palm. The watch had stopped 12 years ago during a storm near Fort Wallace, yet he still carried it everywhere like a man dragging chains nobody else could see. Slowly, he slipped it back into his coat pocket and headed downstairs. By the time the sun climbed over the hills, he was already riding south again. Red Hollow Canyon looked different in daylight. Less haunted, more ancient. The cliffs rose hundreds of feet into the bright morning sky, their shadows cutting across the earth like giant scars left behind by time itself. Buzzards circled lazily overhead. Dry grass bent beneath the warm wind. Somewhere farther ahead, water moved through hidden stone passages with a soft echo that carried for miles. Elias dismounted near the riverbank and tied his horse beneath a crooked cottonwood tree. He did not know what he expected to find there. Maybe nothing. Maybe only silence. Instead, he found her kneeling beside the water, washing blood from the front leg of a gray horse. The animal shifted nervously as Nayeli pressed a folded cloth against the wound with careful hands. Sunlight caught the turquoise beads woven into her braid, making them flash like tiny pieces of sky. She did not look up when she spoke. "You are beginning to make me think white men do not understand warnings." Elias rested his forearms on the saddle horn. "Depends on the warning. This canyon does not belong to you. Never said it did." Finally, she lifted her eyes toward him. There was no softness in them this morning, only exhaustion hidden beneath caution. "Then why are you here again?" Elias glanced toward the horse. "Looks like your mare stepped wrong on the rocks." Nayeli remained silent. The mare stamped nervously beside her, ears twitching toward the canyon walls. Elias moved slowly, careful not to startle either of them, and crouched near the injured leg. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked quietly. "You know horses? Better than people." That almost made her smile. Almost. She hesitated for several seconds before stepping aside. Elias removed his gloves and gently examined the swollen leg. The horse calmed beneath his touch, breathing slower as he wrapped the wound tighter with fresh cloth from his saddlebag. Nayeli watched him closely the entire time, like she expected kindness to turn dangerous without warning. "Most men in town say you hate strangers," Elias said while tying the final knot. "Most men in town are afraid of things they do not understand." "And should I be afraid?" Nayeli looked at him for so long the canyon itself seemed to fall silent around them. Then she answered softly, "That depends how close you plan to get." The words settled into his chest heavier than they should have. Elias stood slowly, brushing dust from his hands, but before he could answer, movement caught his eye near the opposite ridge. 3 riders. Far away, barely visible against the rocks, yet watching. Nayeli noticed them too. Her expression changed instantly. Not fear. Recognition. She stepped toward Elias fast enough to surprise him and grabbed the sleeve of his coat. "You need to leave," she whispered. "Now." Elias looked from her to the distant riders. "Friends of yours?" "No." The wind strengthened suddenly, carrying sand through the canyon floor in long, curling streams. Nayeli released his sleeve and reached for her horse's reins, but Elias noticed something then. Hanging from the saddle was an old cavalry rifle case, weathered with age and marked by faded army letters nearly erased by time. His breathing slowed. He knew those markings. He had seen them before. Years ago, somewhere he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. The riders disappeared before Elias could get a clear look at their faces, swallowed by heat waves and canyon dust like ghosts drifting through stone. But the feeling they left behind stayed heavy in the air long after the ridge stood empty again. Nayeli tightened the saddle strap on her gray mare without another word. Her movements had changed now, quicker, sharper, like someone listening for danger hidden beneath ordinary sounds. Elias rested one hand against the horse's neck and looked again at the faded army markings burned into the leather rifle case. His chest tightened slowly. Fort Wallace Cavalry Division. The same unit he had ridden beside 12 years ago. The same unit he had spent half his life trying to outrun. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. Nayeli's eyes flicked toward the case for half a second before returning to him. "It belonged to my father." Elias felt the canyon grow strangely still around him. Even the river seemed quieter somehow. "Your father worked with the cavalry?" Nayeli shook her head once. "No. He took it from a soldier after the war passed through our land." "War." The words sounded wrong coming from her mouth. Too clean. Too small for the memories it carried. Elias glanced away toward the cliffs, jaw tightening beneath the rough shadow of his beard. He remembered smoke rising through pine trees. Horses screaming in the dark. Men shouting orders nobody questioned fast enough. Mostly, he remembered one Apache man standing beside a fire with a silver pendant hanging against his chest while trying to protect people who could not protect themselves. Elias had not forgotten that face. He doubted he ever would. You should leave now, Nayeli said again, softer this time. Those riders will return before sunset. Elias looked back at her. Who are they? Men who search for things they should leave buried. And what are they searching for? Nayeli hesitated just long enough to answer the question without words. Then she turned toward the river and began washing blood from her hands. Conversation over. Most people would have ridden away then. Elias knew that. But there was something about her silence that felt less like rejection and more like exhaustion. Like a door closed too many times from the inside. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small tin wrapped in cloth. It is only salve, he said, setting it carefully on a flat rock beside her. For the horse. Nayeli looked at the tin suspiciously. Why help me? Elias shrugged lightly. Maybe I am tired of everybody acting like kindness is some kind of trick. For the first time since meeting her, the hardness in her expression weakened slightly. Not gone, just thinner around the edges. She studied him for several long seconds while canyon wind moved through the cottonwood trees above them. Then, without speaking, she picked up the tin and slipped it into her satchel. That tiny gesture should not have mattered. Yet somehow it did. Elias returned to Black Creek near dusk, but Red Hollow Canyon followed him home like dust on his boots. He could still hear her voice while feeding his horse behind the stable. Could still see the way sunlight caught the turquoise beads woven through her braid. Across town, lanterns flickered awake one by one as evening settled over the streets. The smell of coffee and wood smoke drifted through the cooling air. Inside the saloon, men laughed too loudly over card games and cheap whiskey, but Elias stayed outside beneath the fading sky, leaning against the fence rail in silence. You look like a man who forgot where he left his soul, Marshal Brody muttered while stepping onto the porch nearby. Elias gave a faint smile without humor. Maybe I did. The old marshal studied him carefully through cigar smoke. That Apache woman is trouble, son. Elias looked south toward the dark outline of distant canyon cliffs. Funny thing is, he said quietly, I think she has been carrying trouble a lot longer than I have. Before the marshal could answer, a sudden sound broke through the night. Hoofbeats. Fast. Elias straightened immediately as three riders thundered down the far end of Main Street, their horses coated with red canyon dust. The lead rider pulled hard on the reins near the saloon porch and shouted toward the crowd gathering outside. Somebody tell me where to find the Apache woman called Nayeli. Every voice in town went silent. And slowly, very slowly, Elias Mercer felt his hand drift toward the revolver resting at his side. The stranger asking for Nayeli wore a long black coat coated in canyon dust, but it was not the dust Elias noticed first. It was the silver badge pinned beneath the man's collar. Not lawman silver. Army silver. Old cavalry issue. The kind men carried before wars ended and ghosts began. The rider slowly removed his gloves while the entire street watched in silence. Behind him, the other two men stayed, mounted near the hitching post, eyes moving across the town like wolves checking fences before dark. Well, the rider asked again. Where is she? Nobody answered. Lantern light flickered across nervous faces gathered outside the saloon. Even the piano inside had gone quiet. Marshal Brody stepped off the porch carefully, one hand resting near his belt. Black Creek does not answer questions shouted from horseback, the old marshal muttered. The rider looked unimpressed. Then perhaps Black Creek would rather answer to the army. Elias watched the man closely now. Mid-40s. Hard eyes. Clean boots despite 3 days of riding. Not a drifter. Not a bounty hunter. This was someone used to being obeyed. Army left this territory years ago, Elias said calmly from beside the stable fence. The rider's attention shifted toward him immediately. For half a second, something flickered across the man's face. Recognition. Small but real. Elias Mercer, the rider said slowly. Well, that is a surprise. Elias felt his stomach tighten. He knew the voice now. Knew it from freezing nights beside military fires and endless miles beneath desert sun. Captain Warren Pike. Older now. Grayer around the temples. But still carrying himself like the world belonged to men wearing uniforms. You should have stayed gone. Pike continued quietly. I could say the same thing. Marshal Brody glanced between them. You two know each other? Neither answered right away. Wind rolled through the street, carrying loose dirt around their boots. Somewhere farther down Main Street, a dog barked once and fell silent. Pike stepped down from his horse slowly. I am looking for an Apache woman named Nayeli, he said. And I do not enjoy repeating myself. Elias crossed his arms loosely. What does the army want with one woman living in a canyon? Pike smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. Not the army anymore. Private business. That answer bothered Elias more than he expected. Men like Pike never crossed 200 miles of desert for private business. Especially not for someone hiding in Red Hollow Canyon. You should leave her alone, Elias said quietly. Pike's eyes sharpened. Immediately. Careful, Mercer. You are beginning to sound sentimental. The old shame returned fast after that. Faster than whiskey. Faster than nightmares. Elias remembered Pike standing near burning wagons 12 years earlier, giving orders nobody questioned. Orders Elias should have stopped. Orders that still followed him every time darkness settled too quietly around a campfire. You still carry guilt like a saddlebag full of rocks. Pike said softly enough only Elias could hear. That is your problem, not mine. Elias stepped closer before he could stop himself. Why are you really here? Pike studied him for several long seconds. Then he reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded photograph, weathered and creased with age. He held it toward Elias beneath the lantern light. Elias took it slowly. His pulse dropped the moment he looked down. The photograph showed 6 cavalry soldiers standing beside a supply wagon near Fort Wallace. Young faces, dusty uniforms, men pretending they still believed in honorable things. Elias recognized every single one of them. And standing near the center of the photograph, partially hidden beside the wagon wheel, was an Apache man wearing a silver pendant around his neck. Nayeli's father. Elias felt cold all through his chest. Pike leaned closer. That man stole something from us before disappearing into Apache territory, he whispered. Something valuable. Elias lifted his eyes from the photograph. You said he died. Pike's expression never changed. That is what we believe. Silence settled heavily between them after that. Then Pike glanced south toward the dark outline of Red Hollow Canyon beneath the rising moon. But if his daughter is alive, he said quietly, then there is a chance the secret survived too. Some truths follow a man so long they stop feeling like memories and start feeling like weather. Elias Mercer sat alone outside the stable long after the town lamps burned low, staring at the old photograph resting in his hands while cold night wind drifted through Black Creek. The edges of the picture trembled slightly between his fingers. 6 cavalry soldiers. 1 Apache man. 1 secret buried somewhere. Beneath 12 years of silence. Across the empty street, Captain Warren Pike and his riders had rented rooms above the saloon, though Elias doubted any of them were sleeping. Men like Pike only rested when they believed they controlled the room around them. Elias folded the photograph carefully and slipped it inside his coat. But the image refused to leave his mind. Especially the pendant hanging from the Apache man's neck. The same pendant now resting against Nayeli's throat. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang midnight through the cold air. Elias closed his eyes briefly. He remembered another night long ago beside Fort Wallace, when desert wind carried smoke through camp tents while soldiers laughed around whiskey fires pretending war made them important. Elias had been younger then, still foolish enough to think orders and honor belonged in the same sentence. Pike had been different even back then. Calm, charming when needed, dangerous when nobody noticed. You cannot outrun ghosts forever, Mercer. Pike's voice from earlier still echoed inside his head. Elias exhaled slowly and stood from the fence rail. 10 minutes later, he was already saddling his horse beneath moonlight. The stable boy watched nervously from the doorway. You riding south this late? Elias tightened the reins. Only place I can think straight anymore. The ride to Red Hollow Canyon took nearly an hour beneath silver moonlight and drifting clouds. Coyotes called somewhere in the hills while dry grass whispered against his horse's legs. The deeper Elias rode into the canyon, the quieter the world became. No saloon noise. No piano music. Just wind, stone, and the sound of water hidden somewhere beyond the rocks. Then he saw firelight. Small, flickering near the riverbank. Nayeli sat beside a low campfire wrapped in a dark blanket, her gray mare resting nearby beneath the cottonwoods. She did not seem surprised to see him. You really do not listen, she murmured softly without looking up. Elias dismounted slowly. Could say the same thing about you. Nayeli stared into the flames for several seconds before motioning toward a flat stone near the fire. Sit then, cowboy, since you clearly Have nowhere else your soul wishes to be. Elias sat carefully across from her while sparks drifted upward into the cold canyon air. Up close, the firelight softened the sharpness in her features, though the sadness remained untouched beneath her eyes. For a while neither of them spoke. They simply listened to the river moving through darkness. The men looking for you arrived in town, Elias finally said. Nayeli nodded once like she already knew. I saw their tracks before sunset. Who are they? Men chasing old things. Elias studied her quietly. And what are you hiding? Nayeli glanced toward him then, the flames reflecting softly in her dark eyes. You ask questions like someone searching for forgiveness. The words landed harder than they should have. Elias looked away toward the river. Maybe I am. Silence stretched between them again, long enough for the firewood to settle with a soft crack beneath glowing embers. Then Nayeli spoke so quietly he almost missed it. My father once trusted a white soldier. Elias felt his pulse slow instantly. Nayeli kept her eyes on the flames while she spoke. He found the soldier wounded near our land during winter. Cold, hungry, alone. My father carried him 6 miles through snow to keep him alive. She paused briefly, fingers tightening around the blanket draped across her shoulders. Weeks later, soldiers returned to our camp. Elias could barely breathe now. Nayeli looked toward the fire instead of him. After that night, my father stopped believing kindness made men honorable. The canyon wind shifted softly through the trees. Elias stared at the firelight trembling across the stones, unable to force words past the weight pressing against his chest. Because hidden beneath the sound of the river and burning wood, one terrible thought kept rising louder than everything else. He remembered that winter, and he remembered the man who had saved his life. The fire burned low between them, throwing soft orange light across the canyon walls while cold wind drifted through the trees above the river. Elias Mercer sat perfectly still, elbows resting on his knees, staring into the flames like a man afraid of what waited. Beyond them, across from him, Nayeli wrapped her blanket tighter around her shoulders and watched the water moving through the darkness. Neither of them spoke for a long while after her story ended. Some silences feel empty. This one did not. It carried memory inside it. Regret too old for words. Somewhere high above the canyon, thunder rolled faintly across distant hills. A storm was coming. Elias finally lifted his eyes toward her. Did your father ever speak about the soldier he saved? Nayeli nodded once without turning. Only twice. What did he say? She hesitated before answering. He said the soldier looked ashamed even before the snow melted. Elias lowered his gaze immediately. The fire cracked softly between them. Nayeli continued staring toward the river while speaking in that same calm voice that somehow made every word feel heavier. My father believed guilt changes a man faster than age. Elias swallowed hard against the pressure tightening inside his chest, because he remembered that winter clearly now. He had been 26 years old, freezing and half-conscious after getting separated from his cavalry patrol during a storm near the northern ridges. He remembered collapsing beneath pine trees while snow buried the ground around him inch by inch. And he remembered waking inside a small Apache camp wrapped in blankets beside a fire while a man with tired eyes and a silver pendant quietly handed him hot coffee without asking for anything in return. Elias had never learned the man's name, but he remembered the kindness. God, he remembered the kindness. What happened after the soldiers returned? Elias asked carefully. Nayeli's expression darkened slightly beneath the firelight. I was young. I only remember smoke. Horses. My mother crying beside the river. She paused, fingers tightening around the edge of her blanket. After that night, my father buried something deep inside the canyon where no soldier could ever take it. Elias looked up sharply. Nayeli noticed the reaction immediately. You know something? She said quietly. Elias opened his mouth, but no words came out, because the truth sat inside his chest like a bullet too deep to remove. He had known. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to stop it. Enough to remember Captain Pike searching wagons and supply crates for something missing after that winter patrol. Something valuable enough to turn honorable men into hunters. Nayeli slowly turned toward him now, studying his face with growing suspicion. Who are you really, Elias Mercer? The question settled heavily between them. Elias stared at the fire instead of her eyes. Just a cowboy trying to outrun old mistakes. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have tonight. The wind strengthened suddenly, carrying dust through the canyon floor while thunder echoed louder overhead. Nayeli rose from the fire and walked toward her horse without another word. Elias watched her carefully. The distance between them felt different now. Not larger. Worse. More fragile. She reached into one of the saddlebags and pulled out a folded cloth bundle before returning to the fire. Then she tossed it gently toward him. Elias caught it automatically. What is this? Nayeli sat down again beside the flames. Something my father kept hidden after the soldiers came. Elias unfolded the cloth slowly. Inside rested an old photograph, faded almost white with age. His breathing stopped instantly. It was the same photograph Captain Pike had shown him in town. Same soldiers. Same wagon. Same Apache man standing near the center. But this version revealed something the other photograph had been folded carefully to hide. In the corner of the picture, beside the supply wagon wheel, stood a younger Elias Mercer wearing cavalry colors and looking directly toward Nayeli's father. Nayeli saw the blood drain from his face immediately. The fire cracked softly between them, while realization spread through her eyes inch by inch. Then, very slowly, she lifted her gaze toward him. "You knew him," she whispered. Elias could not move, could not breathe, because in that terrible moment, he realized the woman sitting across the fire from him had just discovered the face of the soldier her father once saved from dying in the snow. The fire between them suddenly felt colder than the river running through the canyon. Nayeli stared at the photograph in Elias Mercer's trembling hands while thunder rolled low across the dark sky above Red Hollow. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The only sound came from the wind brushing through the cottonwood trees and the soft crackle of dying firewood collapsing into ash. Then Nayeli slowly stood. Not angry. Somehow worse than angry. Quiet. "You were there," she whispered. Elias lifted his eyes toward her, but the words caught in his throat before they could escape. Because there was no lie left worth telling. Not anymore. Nayeli stepped backward once, the firelight trembling across her face while realization settled into her eyes inch by inch. "All this time," she said softly, almost to herself. "You already knew." Elias rose slowly to his feet. "Nayeli, do not." Her voice sharpened instantly, cutting through the canyon air harder than any blade could have. She looked away from him toward the river, breathing slowly through the storm building inside her chest. "My father carried you through snow while his own hands were freezing." Elias lowered his gaze. "I remember." "Then why did you stay silent?" That question hurt more, because he had asked himself the same thing every night for 12 years. Elias stepped closer to the fire, careful not to move too near her. "Because I was ashamed." Nayeli laughed once under her breath, but there was no humor inside it. Only disbelief. "Ashamed." The word echoed bitterly. "You rode beside the men who destroyed everything my family had." Elias looked at her fully then, rain beginning to fall lightly through the trees around them. "I tried to stop it." Nayeli's eyes flashed toward him immediately. "Tried." Elias swallowed hard. "Pike wanted something your father found near the canyon. Something hidden. The officers believed he stole it from army supply routes." "And did he?" "I do not know." Thunder cracked louder overhead now, while rain tapped softly against the rocks surrounding them. Nayeli folded her arms tightly across herself, though Elias could tell it was not from cold. "My father said greed makes men deaf to mercy." Elias closed his eyes briefly. "Your father was right." Silence stretched painfully between them after that. Then Nayeli walked past the fire toward her horse, movements stiff now, guarded in a way they had not been before. Elias watched her untie the reins with trembling fingers. She was trying hard to keep steady. "Where are you going?" he asked quietly. "Away from you." The answer landed like stone inside his chest. Rainfall thickened around the canyon, while distant lightning illuminated the cliffs in pale silver flashes. Elias stepped toward her carefully. "Nayeli, listen to me." She turned so suddenly the movement startled even the horse beside her. "No. You listen now." Her voice shook for the first time since he met her. Not from fear. From disappointment too deep to hide anymore. "I spent years believing there was at least one white soldier who carried goodness inside him because my father believed it." Elias could not look away from her eyes. "And now?" Nayeli's expression hardened slowly beneath the rain. "Now I think my father saved the wrong man." Those words nearly broke him. Elias stood motionless while she mounted the gray mare beneath the storm-dark sky. Water ran down her hair and shoulders, glimmering silver in the lightning flashes overhead. "Leave before sunrise," she said quietly. "If Pike finds this canyon, blood follows." Elias took another step forward instinctively. "I can help you." Nayeli shook her head once. "You already helped them once before." The storm wind swept through the canyon hard enough to scatter sparks from the dying fire into darkness. Then Nayeli looked down at him one final time, sadness buried deep beneath the anger in her eyes. "You kept riding too close, cowboy," she whispered. "Now you finally understand why I warned you." A second later, she turned the horse toward the canyon shadows and disappeared into the rain, leaving Elias Mercer standing alone beside the dying fire with 12 years of guilt crashing down around him harder than the storm itself. By sunrise, Red Hollow Canyon looked like the kind of place God forgot on purpose. Rainwater still dripped from the cliffs in slow silver streams, while low fog crawled through the rocks near the riverbank. Elias Mercer had not slept. He sat beneath the cottonwood tree where Nayeli left him hours earlier, hat resting beside his boots, eyes fixed on the dying fire that had long since turned to ash. Some men spend years preparing speeches for forgiveness. Elias realized too late there were no words heavy enough for what he carried. Hoofbeats shattered the morning silence. Elias looked up immediately as 3 riders emerged through the canyon mist. Captain Warren Pike rode in front, dark coat damp from the storm, his horse moving slowly across the muddy ground. The 2 riders behind him carried rifles across their saddles, eyes sweeping the canyon walls carefully. Pike studied Elias for a long moment before speaking. "I had a feeling you would come back here." Elias stood slowly. "You should not have followed me." Pike glanced around the canyon with open curiosity. "Beautiful place." Then his expression hardened slightly. "Makes sense why he hid it here." Elias felt his jaw tighten. "There is nothing here for you." Pike smiled faintly. "That is where you are wrong." He reached into his saddlebag and removed an old leather journal wrapped tightly in cloth. Even from 10 feet away, Elias recognized the faded cavalry markings burned into the cover. Pike tossed it toward him carelessly. Elias caught it against his chest. "Read the last page," Pike said. Wind moved softly through the canyon, while Elias opened the journal with stiff fingers. Most pages contained supply records, patrol routes, faded signatures from men long dead. But near the end, one entry stopped him cold. October 3rd, 1874. Hidden silver shipment moved through Red Hollow before winter storms. Apache scout witnessed burial site near Northern Ridge. Eliminate witnesses if necessary. Elias stared at the words until they blurred beneath his eyes. Pike dismounted calmly nearby. "Your Apache friend's father saw us bury Army silver before we could transport it east," he said quietly. "A fortune in government payroll disappeared after that storm." Elias slowly lowered the journal. "So you destroyed his camp over money?" Pike's face remained perfectly still. "No, Mercer. Men destroyed that camp because fear makes soldiers obedient." The canyon suddenly felt colder than the storm itself. Elias looked toward the river where Nayeli had sat beside him the night before, and shame hit him harder than any fist ever could. Because she had been right. He had helped them once already. "Where is she?" Pike asked. Elias said nothing. Pike sighed softly, almost disappointed. Still trying to play hero after all these years. One of the riders behind Pike suddenly pointed toward the cliffs. Movement. Elias turned instantly. High above the canyon ridge stood 6 Apache riders watching silently against the pale morning sky. Nayeli sat among them on her gray mare, wind moving through her dark braid, while her expression remained unreadable from the distance. Pike narrowed his eyes. "Well, there she is." The riders behind him shifted nervously in their saddles, but Elias stepped forward before anyone else could move. "No," Pike glanced at him. "Excuse me." Elias slowly removed the revolver from his belt and dropped it into the wet dirt between them. Then came the rifle, then the hunting knife hidden beneath his coat. Pike watched in disbelief while Elias stood unarmed beneath the canyon fog. "I am done carrying your ghosts," Elias said quietly. Pike's voice sharpened instantly. "Careful, Mercer." But Elias barely heard him anymore. His eyes remained fixed on Nayeli standing high above the canyon. "Your father saved my life," he called upward through the wind. "And I repaid that kindness with silence when it mattered most." The Apache riders remained motionless. Elias swallowed hard against the weight crushing his chest. "I cannot change what happened. His voice nearly broke then. But I will not let his daughter carry it alone. For the first time since sunrise, Nayeli's expression shifted slightly. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something quieter. Sadder. Then Pike reached slowly toward the revolver at his side, and the entire canyon seemed to stop breathing at once. For one long second, nobody moved. The canyon stood silent beneath the gray morning sky while cold wind swept through the rocks and carried mist across the river below. Elias Mercer remained unarmed in the center of Red Hollow, his revolver buried in wet dirt at his feet, his eyes fixed not on Captain Warren Pike, but on the woman watching from the ridge above. Nayeli sat motionless on her gray mare beside the Apache riders, dark hair moving softly in the wind, while the turquoise pendant rested against her chest like a memory refusing to fade. Pike's hand lingered near his revolver. You always did confuse guilt with courage, he muttered coldly. Elias finally looked toward him. No, courage would have been stopping you 12 years ago. The words landed harder than the storm winds still drifting through the canyon. Pike's expression darkened slightly, though he quickly forced the calmness back onto his face. You think confessing changes history? Elias shook his head slowly. No, but maybe silence is what kept men like you alive too long. The Apache riders above shifted slightly in their saddles. Not threatening. Watching. Waiting. Pike noticed them too. You really believe they will forgive you? Elias glanced back toward Nayeli. I am not asking them to. Rainwater dripped steadily from the cliffs while the canyon seemed to grow quieter with every passing breath. Then Pike smiled faintly and reached into his coat pocket. You know, he said softly, your Apache friend's father almost made it easy for himself. Elias felt his chest tighten instantly. Pike unfolded a yellowed map worn thin from years of being hidden. All he had to do was tell us where the silver was buried. Elias stared at the map without moving. You still do not understand, do you? Pike narrowed his eyes slightly. Elias looked toward the canyon walls surrounding them. That man was never protecting silver. Pike laughed under his breath. Then what exactly did he die protecting? Before Elias could answer, a voice drifted down from the ridge above them. Calm. Steady. Nayeli. Families. Every eye turned upward toward her. She slowly guided her horse a few steps down the rocky slope until morning light caught the silver pendant hanging near her throat. My father hid Apache families inside these canyon caves during the winter soldiers came searching for gold, she said quietly. The silver was never important to him. Pike's expression hardened instantly. You are lying. Nayeli's gaze never left his face. You crossed 200 miles chasing money buried beneath rocks while my father spent his last winter hiding children from freezing storms. The wind carried her words through the canyon like prayer. Pike looked suddenly smaller standing there beside his horse. Older too, like greed had finally become too heavy for even him to carry upright. Elias watched Nayeli carefully while something inside his chest slowly loosened for the first time in years. Not forgiveness. Something quieter than that. Understanding. Pike folded the map sharply and stepped backward toward his horse. You are all making a mistake, he snapped. But the authority inside his voice was already gone. Even the two riders behind him looked uncertain now, eyes shifting toward the Apache warriors watching silently from above. Nobody reached for a weapon. Nobody needed to. Some men lose long before they realize nobody fears them anymore. Pike mounted his horse stiffly and looked once more toward Elias. You could have had half that silver, Mercer. Elias shook his head slowly. I already spent 12 years paying for enough. For a moment Pike looked ready to say something else. Instead, he pulled hard on the reins and turned his horse toward the canyon entrance. The other riders followed behind him without another word, disappearing slowly into the morning fog until only silence remained again. Elias stood there breathing quietly while water moved through the river beside him. Above, the Apache riders began turning their horses away one by one. All except Nayeli. She remained still on the ridge, watching him beneath the pale morning light. Elias picked up neither his gun nor his rifle. He simply rested one hand against the damp leather of his saddle and prepared to leave. Then her voice stopped him. Cowboy. Elias turned slowly. Nayeli guided her horse farther down the slope until only a few feet separated them now. Up close, he could see exhaustion beneath her eyes. Sadness too, but the anger had softened somewhere during the storm. You are still too close, she said quietly. Elias gave a tired smile, filled with more. regret than humor. I figured that had not changed. For the first time since they met, Nayeli almost smiled back. Almost. Then she looked toward the river where morning sunlight finally broke through the clouds. Stay anyway, she whispered softly. And out there beneath the endless canyon sky, with wind moving through cottonwood trees and the sound of water echoing against ancient stone, Elias Mercer realized some forms of forgiveness arrive without grand speeches. Sometimes they arrive